she was brains and brawn. She was a great legal mind and impressive weightlifter. She was the notorious RBG, also known as Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was a champion of individuals' rights. She was a mother, a grandmother, and a devoted partner for decades. She was a committed Jew. In her chambers, Justice Ginsburg kept the instruction of the Torah, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue, framed on her wall. And she wore those words embroidered in her collar to the opening of her last Supreme Court session. She held the words of Torah up to the highest levels and was guided by them in her life. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the judge of truth. These words were said when we heard of her death. They are said in Judaism when we hear news of a death. They held particular significance as a rabbi said them in the Supreme Court building at the funeral of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Blessed is the judge of truth. These words were said in honor of a mortal judge of truth. In the days following her death, the body of Justice Ginsburg lay in state in the Supreme Court and the Capitol buildings. She was the first Jew and the first woman ever to have that honor. I was deeply moved by the photographs of Justice Ginsburg's law clerks on the steps of the Supreme Court and around her coffin as they performed shmirah, the Jewish ritual of guarding a body. Justice Ginsburg's life was honored in a traditional Jewish ceremony. Her soul was blessed with the sacred words of the El Malei Rachamim prayer. The people of the United States and the whole world listened as this Hebrew prayer was chanted. It was a historic moment for the Jewish people and for our country. Justice Ginsburg's life was honored with a Jewish funeral inside the hallowed halls of the United States Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was inspired to bring more justice to all people because of her Jewish values. She applied those values to her understanding of secular law and legal theory. Her deeply held Jewish values informed her secular thinking. But she separated the two, keeping religion out of her legal decisions. Of course, each Supreme Court justice, each elected official, each lawmaker carries their own ethnicity, culture, perhaps religion as part of their identity. But America does not have an official religion. All are welcome here. America was founded as a refuge from religious persecution. Over the centuries, we've come to rely on the belief that church and state must be kept separate. The exact term, separation of church and state, is believed to have first been used by Thomas Jefferson in a letter in 1802. He was referencing the First Amendment to the Constitution, which was ratified in December of 1791. The First Amendment guarantees that, quote, Congress shall make no law representing an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This guarantee has made it possible for people of all religions to live in this country equally. In 1802, Jefferson wrote, quote, believing that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes accounting to none other for his faith or his worship, I contemplate thus building a wall of separation between church and state. This separation has defined our American culture over the last 2 centuries, ensuring that no one ethnic or religious group would have legal privilege above another. It is the foundation of this melting pot that we American Jews have been fortunate to call home. The separation of church and state has allowed us and other ethnic and religious groups to survive and thrive here, to become American. Until now. Until this moment in history. Now we live in an America that seems to be forgetting its promise. We find ourselves in a country where the separation of church and state is increasingly in danger. So is our protection under American law. In 1953, my mother and her family came to this country after having survived many years as refugees on other continents. They came here because they believed that they would be able to start all over again and truly become Americans. They arrived with no money, no English, nothing really, but hope. My father's family came earlier from Turkey and Poland. Like many immigrants to this country, they fled persecution, poverty, lack of opportunity. Most of us are here because of ancestors who believed in a new life in America. They dreamed of living here without the fear and discrimination that had been part of their lives elsewhere. Even if your family didn't directly survive persecution, the collective experience of our ancestors informs who we are as a Jewish people today. We know how critical protection from inequality, social and financial isolation, anti-Semitism, and physical attack is. For us and for every ethnic and religious group to live securely in this country, we need the guarantees of the First Amendment. We know all too well what life is like when those protections are not guaranteed by a government. For the first time since 1776, we find ourselves faced with an unthinkable possibility. Perhaps the America we live in today is not a place where Jews can live freely. I'm not ready to leave, and I imagine you aren't either. But we live in a country where democracy and the protections at the core of our democracy are at risk. In a fundamentalist linking of religion and democracy, some people are trying to revoke the core values of the America that welcomed my ancestors and yours. Just last week on Rosh Hashanah morning, we read the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Take your son, your only son, the one you love. Abraham hears God instruct him to do this. Sacrifice your son to show your piety, Abraham hears. Each year I've read this story with confusion, wondering how a man could be so focused on his own interpretation of God's instruction that he almost plunges a giant knife into his beloved son. Abraham wants to prove his piety at all costs. He doesn't even think about the consequences. Each year I've wondered how Abraham could have walked through the world with such blinders on, caring only about his religious fervor and fundamentalism. But this year, the Akedah seems so plausible to me, so contemporary. We're living the Akedah. Right now, we find ourselves in a society where our own leaders are willing to sacrifice us and the future of democracy for an adherence to false piety. A terrifying fundamentalism hangs over us, like the sharp ma'achelet, the knife that was suspended in the air over Isaac. Democracy, freedom, and all that we love in America lies vulnerably below it in the name of devotion to God. Isaac lay bound on the rock. From nearby, a quiet rustling could be heard, a ram caught in the thicket. As the ram tried to free himself, the rustling breaks Abraham's intense concentration. He looks up. Abraham, Abraham! An angel calls out to Abraham, don't do it. Don't harm that which you love so much. for any reason, not even what you think is piety. Wake up, Abraham, the angels scream. Wake up, America, they yell to us now. A religious fervor of fundamentalism has gripped our nation, a white religious nationalism that some mistakenly call piety. Like Abraham, whose devotion to his own piety nearly allowed him to kill his son, there is a very dangerous frenzy in this country parading as piety. It is endangering our future. It is threatening to sacrifice our democracy. This frightening trajectory is one that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg warned us about many years ago. In 2005, in the famous case McCreary County versus the ACLU of Kentucky, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that displaying the Ten Commandments in courthouses and public schools violated the First Amendment. The justices ruled that by posting them in public spaces, not all Americans were represented equally. Since that famous decision supporting a separation of church and state, our country has become more and more conservative, more and more accepting of the idea of one religion in America, one nation indivisible under one God with liberty and justice for some. In her 2014 dissent in the famous Hobby Lobby case, Justice Ginsburg argued that allowing employers to impose their own religious beliefs on employees should be illegal, but somehow the court allowed it. It became legal to impose an employer's religious views on a company's employees. How could this be? Ginsburg's searing dissent rejected the idea that religious freedom lets you impose your religious beliefs on others. Yet the Supreme Court allowed this. The situation in our country has continued to get worse. In just the last few months, rulings have been made at the highest levels of law and government that endanger our future, the future of democracy and pluralism in America. The very same people who want to guarantee individual rights, rights to own a gun, rights to practice a religion, rights to make medical choices that are aligned with your own religious beliefs, want to take individual freedoms away from other people who don't share their views. A dangerous and growing faction of America's leadership is willing to impose one interpretation of religious ethics on all of us. Those who insist on reuniting church and state are destroying the very essence of America. We American Jews seem to have been assuming that the Bill of Rights would protect us, as it has for 200 years. But earlier this summer, the precariousness of our democracy became apparent to all. We realized that personal religious freedom in this country lies bound to a rock, and a sharp knife looms right overhead. Wake up, American Jews. This summer, our very conservative Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. The significance of this decision cannot be overstated. It is a canary in the mine. The Dobbs decision allows individual states to make laws that violate some religions' beliefs, like ours. States will have the right to make laws about access to abortion or lack thereof. Judaism has always been progressive on abortion, supporting the physical and mental health of the mother. Judaism teaches that human life is of the utmost importance and that life begins at birth. So access to abortion has always been supported by Jewish law. The First Amendment guarantees us and all Americans that no law will prohibit the free exercise of any religion. But the Dobbs decision does just that. It allows for laws to prohibit the free exercise of our religion. And it may be a springboard to revisiting other previously settled cases as well. In a lawsuit filed this summer, Congregation Lador Vador, a progressive synagogue in Palm Beach, Florida, challenged legislation that bans most abortion, arguing that it violates the tenet of freedom of religion. Rabbi Barry Silver, the congregation's rabbi, is a former Democratic member of the Florida House of Representatives and an attorney. He stated the problem we now face succinctly. He said, "The ruling criminalizes the practice of Judaism." In an opinion written this summer, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, quote, "With these decisions, the court elevates one religious exercise over society's interest in protecting the separation between church and state." We need to wake up to the terrible reality of what is happening around us. For 200 years, Jews lived more or less well in the United States. Yes, there were social clubs and country clubs that prohibited Jews, and quotas at many of the nation's best universities restricted Jewish admission. This has not been a perfect country for us to live in, but it has certainly been a very good one. We, in turn, have contributed tremendously to American society and success. Over the last many decades, society has changed. Jews have become increasingly integrated and acculturated into American society. Who would have thought it possible that Jews would be included in presidential families? Presidents Clinton, Trump, and Biden all have Jewish grandchildren. We hoped one day that we would get here, arrive, so to speak, at a time when we wouldn't need to worry anymore that we were outsiders. But ironically, as we've become more and more insiders as Jewish individuals, our own religious liberty has been threatened. The Jewish community in this country is actually more vulnerable than we ever have been in history. Prayer on public school football fields, religious flags at City Hall, the lack of separation of church and state that is taking over our country erodes our security here. In an NBC News article from June, Rabbi Ed Feinstein, many of you have studied with him in his visits here, was quoted as saying, "We as Jews can feel something in the air. When people start losing their rights, we sense the danger that comes with that." As I've been reading articles about the demise of our society, I was reminded of an experience I had many years ago. In 1999 and 2000, I served as the student rabbi of the Juneau Jewish community in Alaska. On one of my visits, I was asked if I would give the opening benediction for a session of the Alaska State Legislature. I was excited to sit in on the session and learn about local issues. Salmon stuck in various pipes, moose too close to the airport runways, and the like. The night before I was to give the benediction, I had dinner with Ethan Berkowitz. Some of you may know him. He grew up here in San Francisco. He went on to become the mayor of Anchorage, but while I was in Juneau, Ethan was the Alaska State Representative serving as the Democratic Party minority leader. "Let's get dinner at the Silver Bow," he said to me. It was the one restaurant in town owned by a Jewish woman. We sat at the bar and schmoozed over dinner. Our grandmothers had been friends, though we didn't know each other. After a friendly chat, he got serious. "We need to talk about tomorrow," Ethan said. He continued, "I plan to make a scene when you start talking." Ethan explained that he had been a vocal opponent of prayer at legislative meetings. There was no place, he said, for religion in the State House. He told me that he tried not to be rude as various ministers and other clergy people gave benedictions. But since a rabbi was coming, he wanted to prove his point. The next morning, I walked into the State House. I was wearing a black suit. Pretty much everyone else was wearing a plaid flannel shirt. I went up to the podium, pulled out my notes, and adjusted the microphone. Everyone bowed their heads, waiting for God's name to be invoked. I didn't mention God. I began, "There is an old Hasidic tale." Ethan loudly slammed the top of his desk shut. All eyes were on him. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and walked out of the room. I smiled to myself and then continued. I've often thought of that moment and an important lesson I learned: religion doesn't belong in our legislative spaces. America is not a secular country. There is religion everywhere, but no particular religion should be imposed anywhere. Justice Ginsburg was proud of her Judaism and inspired by it. On the occasion of the opening day of her last Supreme Court term, Justice Ginsburg chose to wear a collar that was specially commissioned for her and honored her Jewish values. She received the collar as a gift from Moment magazine, along with Moment's inaugural Human Rights Award. Moment's editor-in-chief, Nadine Epstein, explained, "Justice Ginsburg embodies a principal tenet of Judaism, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue." Justice Ginsburg spent her life and career fighting for more freedoms, more opportunities, more equality for individuals, because she herself was inspired by the Torah. The Hebrew letters that were embroidered into the collar around her neck reminded her of the Jewish belief she held so deeply, that justice is holy. Religion can inspire people to live morally, to consider their actions carefully, to help others. Many Jewish people marched during the civil rights movement, citing their Judaism as the ethical value system that inspired them to fight for equality. In 1965, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched arm in arm with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. When he returned, Rabbi Heschel famously said he had been praying with his feet. Jewish values inspired him to work for equal rights for all. At the end of Yom Kippur, we hear the blast of the shofar one last time. It is a reminder to us as we re-enter the world, live with awareness. The sound of the ram's horn, the very same symbol that woke up Abraham, is intended to wake us up too. The Tekiah Gedola sends us back to the world more alert, ready to act. What can we do? We have to demand that our basic right to freedom of religion be upheld. Read, rally, vote. Start by learning about Prop 1. It'll be on our ballot. It's California's response to the Dobbs decision. In just a few weeks, we will get to vote on it. It's an important model for the rest of our country, a beginning as we navigate this territory. For the first time, I think I understand why God instructs Abraham to sacrifice his son. By binding him to the rock and nearly plunging the knife into his beloved son, Abraham learns the value of his survival. It is a lesson for us today. Tekiah, wake up. The final blast of the shofar shatters the silence and demands that we see the truth in front of us, too. Like Isaac's was, our survival is at stake. Like it did for Abraham on Mount Moriah, let the ram's horn shake us from our silence. Gamar Chatima Tova. May we all be inspired for blessing in the book of life. Amen.